Of course, today I'll kind of, like I said, I'll kind of have this part two lecture. I'll kind of continue talking about the rise of the British Empire. Primarily, I'll talk about the Stuart dynasty, House of Stuart. Of course, that dominates Britain up to like the early 18th century. And then I will kind of spend a few minutes talking about the later dynasties they have, especially the House of Hanover, and then also the more recent one that's now in power now, like Queen Elizabeth II, of course, House of Windsor as well. Like I said, I'm going to move on to talk about, I think from last time, I know we had started to talk about the English Civil War. I think we were at least talking about the outbreak of it, which occurs in 1642. Remember the conflicts between King Charles I and, of course, Parliament. So we were kind of talking about that. I know we were also talking about the rise of the English, the parliamentarian army, of course, the new model army, which you see there, which was that parliamentarian army that opposed Charles I's reign. His want to be like an absolute ruler. So I think we talked about how that formed in 1645 to fight against the Royalist army in England. And then I'm going to also talk about a few of the battles that were, of course, were famous during the English Civil War. Of course, I'll expand that one. That's the actual battle site, the Battle of Naseby, which took place on June 14th, 1645. That battle is considered to be really the most pivotal battle of the First English Civil War, because remember, there were like really three English Civil Wars that actually occurred. Actually, these three are really the most famous ones they had, especially in the First English Civil War. They had one called the Battle of Edge Hill, which was fought in October 1642. That was fought north of London, and it was really an indecisive battle where Charles's royalist forces tried to march on London, but neither side could really win, and so nothing really happened from that. I think at the beginning of the war, that both sides' armies were really not developed very well. Marston Moor, that battle is more famous, July 2nd, 1644. That was actually the largest battle of the whole English Civil War, where combined almost 40,000 troops fought in northern England near Yorkshire. And anyway, actually, that battle was really the first decisive battle of the war, where the parliamentarian side actually won, and they took control of northern England, which was kind of bad for Charles, because Charles lost a lot of power when he, of course, lost that area of England. But yeah, Naseby, that battle is really the most strategic, really, battle of the whole war. It was fought in Northamptonshire, north of London. And there were different commanders that were associated with it. On the parliamentarian side, which is the new model army that we talked about, they really had two generals that were real important. On the left there, you see Sir Thomas Fairfax, which I've talked about before. He was really the head of the actual new model army at the beginning of the war. They called him Black Tom because he had kind of a tan complexion, and I think he wore kind of a black type uniform, and so hence the name. And then on the right, you have Oliver Cromwell, who was a member of Parliament, a Puritan. He really, by the end of the war, becomes the commander-in-chief of the parliamentarian forces. And he had a nickname, too. They called him Old Ironsides, but he was also sometimes called Puritan Moses because he was very religious and, of course, a strict Puritan, if you know about Cromwell. Cromwell is kind of controversial later because he later takes over England, seizes power, and becomes like a dictator. So he's kind of a controversial figure if you know about this in British history. Then on the royalist side, you've got Charles I, of course, the head of the army with Prince Rupert of the Rot. That was a nephew, of course, of Charles I. He commanded a lot of the forces in a lot of the battles. I think primarily Prince Rupert was a cavalry general. It's actually a pretty good general, but they really are outnumbered if you know about what happened at the Battle of Naseby. And Here's some stats on the battle. The New Mount Army at that battle had about 13,000 troops, which was a combination of infantry and cavalry. The cavalry was led by Oliver Cromwell, and I think that you know about it. His cavalry was known as the Ironsides, and hence he was called Old Ironsides because he was, I guess, older. And then the Royalist side only had about 7,500 men, which I think a lot of it was cavalry. And you can see in the battle that Prince Rupert tried to attack the left flank of the parliamentarian forces, but most of the action took place in the center and also the left flank of Charles' forces. And they got clobbered, you know, about this. The army of Charles I was effectively destroyed. Like 3/4 of it was killed, wounded, and captured. In fact, more than half of it was captured, you know, about this. And a lot of them were actually paraded through the streets of London afterwards. So basically, Charles was humiliated after that battle. And they really never, the Royalist side in Charles I never really recovered from really the Battle of Naseby. Charles would later be captured, but he would actually escape to Scotland at one point. So yeah, that's kind of that. That was pretty much the end of the First English Civil War at that point. Then they had this other deal that happened where Charles eventually escaped to Scotland, and he formed this alliance with these Scottish Presbyterians that were known as the Covenanters. And they were called this because of the fact that they had made this covenant that what they would do in Scotland with the Kirk or the Church of Scotland was that they would not, you know, go the way of England, which, you know, had Episcopalian type governance where they had bishops and things like that, priests. And, you know, the Presbyterian Church didn't really want to have, they wanted presbyters or these church elders instead. And so they made this deal with Charles that they would back him if he would allow the Church of Scotland to just have presbyters instead of, like, say, priests or bishops. I think it was called the Engagement, and I think the ones that were involved were called the Engagers, and so hence the name that was called. And so Cromwell had to eventually invade, basically, into the north at that point. I think in what is northern England, city of Preston, it's called. The Covenanters were eventually defeated in August of 1648. They were actually routed. See that bridge right there? That's where most of the action took place at that battle. And the Scottish forces, most of their forces, like 13,000, were either killed or captured in the battle. Cromwell's forces, like the New Mount Army, was superior to really any army that they had in Britain. He only lost maybe 100 men. That's it. So that's how good of a force he was. And so Cromwell is often seen as this, you know, military genius and all that. Well, Charles on the right, he eventually gets captured, if you know about that. And what happens is he's eventually put on trial for treason against the state. This is one of the things that happens. He's put on trial for treason. And you know about Charles, he refused to, you know, make a plea, whatever the plea was about it. And the reason why was because of the fact that he viewed himself as this absolutist. And so he didn't believe that there ought to be like a constitutional monarchy or a limited monarchy and things like that. He thought he had divine right, you know, and things like that. And so they had this man that purged a lot of the members of Parliament that were kind of in support of Charles. They didn't want to put him on trial, have him killed or anything like that. And so they became known as Pride's Purge afterwards. And Pride and a bunch of others were part of a bunch of regicides that eventually would, you know, put Charles to death eventually. Because I think on January 27th, I think is the date, 1649, he was found guilty at that point. So that High Court of Justice declared that, you know, basically that he's, you know, pretty much guilty. And they eventually will execute him 3 days later. Here's kind of a picture image showing them cutting basically Charles's head off, which, by the way, is considered to be it's a very controversial event, in British history. There's not too many cases where a state, executes its monarch. I think you see that in the French Revolution, with Louis the 16th, that occurring, but that's kind of rare that kind of happened. And I forget the number of people that were on the death warrant, but it was like close to around 50, I think, that were on it. But Oliver Cromwell, I think, is the one you can see. That's the third on the left, like the third down. He's one of the first names that's, of course, put on the death warrant, of course, of Charles I. So that's the death warrant you're looking at, of course, right there. Now, it wasn't over. They had another civil war later, the so-called Third English Civil War, 1649 to 51. This was where what happened was Prince Charles, just later known as Charles II, they call him, or the son of Charles I. He actually shows up in Scotland to try to take power. The Scots are angry about the fact that they've executed Charles I, so they decide to back him. So they declare him king at that point. And so Cromwell is forced basically to invade, Scotland at that point. That leads to what they call the Battle of Dunbar, which you see there. There's actually several battles, I guess, that happened between 1650 to 51. That was considered one of the last major battles. They have a few others, like the Battle of Worcester, I think, that happened later in 1651. But even though they defeat the Scots, like routed them and all that, Prince Charles was able to escape to France. And so he'll later come back later. That's a big story I'll get to later. There's a story supposedly where Cromwell was trying to capture Prince Charles, and he hid in an oak tree, try to prevent him being captured. We'll talk about that later. But Cromwell, by pretty much the end of the Civil War, he takes control of the country. And the period of his reign, it's got different names. They often call it either the Commonwealth period as a common name that they'll call it, like the Commonwealth of England, I think is a name they'll call it. They call it sometimes the Protectorate as well. And some people call it the Interregnum. And it's this Republican period where the British actually abolished the monarchy. There was no monarchy in the country. And Oliver Cromwell became this head of state that was propped up by the military. And so basically he was a military dictator, Oliver Cromwell. And they gave him different titles. I think the common title he was called was Lord Protector, but they also had other names. They called him like head of state, I think was another name that they called Cromwell. I think another name they called him they actually called him Your Highness, believe it or not. And I think there was even talk of making Cromwell king, like King Oliver as well, almost king in name, but he didn't really want to be a monarch. So he kind of despised the monarchy and things like that. And Cromwell has got a bad name. If you know about Cromwell, he's real famous for going over to Ireland. Ireland rebelled, if you know about this, while all this is kind of going on with the English Civil War. And so Cromwell, what he did was he basically invaded Ireland and reconquered it within like a 3-year period with the new model army, and forced them to submit to Commonwealth rule at that point. And so a lot of Irish cities that refused to basically bend to his rule were sacked and destroyed. I know 2 cities, which were Wexford and Drogheda, were practically destroyed, and they're not sure the number, but they seem to think that the British going into English going into Ireland may have resulted in close to 40% of the Irish population succumbing eventually to casualties or death. And I think if you have the exact number, they think, but maybe 500,000 Irish may have died because of Cromwell's policies. And so Cromwell is not a very well-liked man. He was still hated today in Ireland. You go over there, of course. And so that's something he's kind of known for. The other thing he's known for, too, I'll mention as well about Cromwell. Cromwell also forced a lot of Puritanism on the really English people and others as a whole. If you get the life, pretty much the life under him is totally changed. You can kind of here see a list of things that they did, but strict Puritanism was pushed pretty much on England during that period. So any kind of forms of entertainment were pretty much ended at that point. Closed down pubs. I know the Puritans pretty much got rid of the Globe Theater. They pretty much closed it down. A lot of blue laws were enacted, so you couldn't do certain things on Sunday. They banned Christmas, believe it or not. The Puritans, a lot of men and women couldn't dress a certain way. Like women couldn't dress lewdly and things like that. Women couldn't wear makeup and things like that. And a lot of this was pushed also in New England as well, because you have Puritanism over there, like in Massachusetts as well. So Sunday was seen as a very special day of the Puritans, holy day, and so that's Cromwell. Cromwell, of course, was very, very religious, of course, and all that. Cromwell eventually died, though, and he died of natural causes, and his son took over afterwards. This is after reigning for a few years as the head of state. Cromwell was not as powerful as his father. I don't think he was a military mind like Oliver Cromwell was, and all that. And he didn't have the backing of the military new model army like I guess Cromwell did. And so his reign only lasted about 9 months as Lord Protector from 1658 to 59. And he was eventually overthrown in a military coup where they basically deposed him. And royalists later gave him nasty nicknames like Tumble Down Dick, Queen Dick, because he was seen as this weak, really ineffectual ruler. And so I think Richard was eventually forced to go into exile, but he later returned to England later. Now, I want to talk about what happened next. What occurs next is the British decide in England to restore the Stuart dynasty. They do have a parliament that meets between April to December of 1660, which was called the Convention Parliament, where they basically proclaim the son of Charles I as now the British monarch, which became Charles II, as they called him. And so this was later referred to as the restoration of the Stuart or Stuart dynasty on the British throne. There, of course, you can see a picture of Charles II on the right. I'll get to it later, but he had a nickname. He was known as the Merry Monarch, usually spelled like that, or sometimes in the Old English, they'll also spell it Mary as in Merrie. So it's spelled either way. But that's the date he was crowned, or I guess when they restored the monarchy, May 29th, 1660. It is known as Restoration Day, or they have other names they called it too when he came to power. So he kind of celebrated for years. I don't know if they celebrate much anymore in Britain that much, but Oak Apple Day or Royal Oak Day, I think, is another nickname they call that day when they restore the monarchy. And it came from the fact that Charles II, when I think during the Third English Civil War, when he was almost about to be captured by Cromwell's forces, he hid in an oak tree to prevent being captured. And so because of that, he was still alive and be able to become monarch. These are, by the way, the later monarchs that are kind of part of the Stuart dynasty they have in power. So after Charles II is in power, he does have a brother I'll get to later, which is James II, the Duke of York. They called him. William III and Mary II are also called William and Mary. They're also rulers later. They were the nephew and daughter of James II. And then also Queen Anne was the last of the Stuarts that ruled Britain, was the daughter of James II. So those are all the different ones that are well known. That's this kind of an image showing base of the restoration, of course, of Charles II He was kind of a popular ruler, although a lot of the British kind of somewhat mistrusted the Stuart dynasty because of their links to Scotland, and but also because of their links to Catholicism. Because some of the Stuarts were Catholic, if you know about that. And so that was kind of an issue. And they had a lot of connections to, of course, suburban France as well. There, of course, is Charles II, an image of him on the right. Like I said, Charles had a nickname. He was known as the Merry Monarch. This was a nickname that he got because of the fact that he had a very loose court, very liberal. And he also was known for having a lot of mistresses, which is true about that, like close to about a dozen, I believe. And he had numerous. He fathered a lot of illegitimate children, so much that I think he had a wife who was Portuguese named Catherine of Braganza, but for some reason didn't have any legitimate children that survived. So he had all these children. I think the joke about Charles II, he had so many illegitimate children that he was known as the father of England because of that. There were some things that happened under him that were interesting. They had this thing called the Cavalier Parliament that took place between 1651 and 1670. That was the main parliament that was in power under him, and they reversed a lot of the policies of Cromwell. Because so what happened with that, they got rid of Puritanism. So in England, that's why England became more liberal afterwards. They brought back different kinds of entertainment, which some was lewd, pretty much as well. They also had this thing called the Clarendon Code, which shored up the Anglican Church to make that the official, state church and all that. And so at that time, they still didn't really have any religious rights for religious minorities, like Catholics or whatever. But that basically, strictly said that that's the pretty much church they're going to have. So you had the Puritans and others that wanted to do different things overall. I'll kind of talk about some famous events that happened under King Charles II, the Merry Monarch. One of the most famous events that happened was the Great Plague of London, which happened over a year and a half between 1665 to 1666. It was a major outbreak of bubonic plague, which was later called, if you know about it in modern times, the Black Death or Black Plague. And the Black Death, if you know about it, was a serious outbreak of bubonic plague, which was spread by rats, like rat fleas, from a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which you may have heard of. And Yersinia pestis, if you know about it, was a type of bacterium that wasn't discovered till, by the way, the late 19th century, I think in Hong Kong, China, by this French-Swiss doctor named Alexander Yersin. And so that's what they call it, Yersinia pestis, if you know about it. And the plague itself killed many people. I think they say maybe the plague of London killed 100,000 or more at one point, which was actually 1/4 of the population of London. So that had devastating effects on London overall. It's one of like several plagues that still outbreak, in the up to like at least I want to say up to the 19th century, they have a lot of these outbreaks of bubonic plague that keep occurring. As far as Europe and all the way to Asia and even parts of Africa, they have these bubonic plagues that break out. And of course, here's images of people with the bubonic plague. The plague, was known for its famous bobos, these sores that they get on their body, which are inflammations of the lymph nodes. And so they'd get that all over the body that they'd have. Also, a lot of different types of symptoms, coughing, high fever, things like that are also kind of associated with it. And a lot of times if people got it, they died within like a few days. So it wasn't long before death would occur because of it. But that's why they call it bubonic plague, because of the bobos that are on the body. That's also where they get the term bobo from, which sometimes people still use that today for sores that are on the body. or whatever. And kind of talk about a few things with that. But the British actually began to try to they actually began to quarantine people, like people that got the plague. They would basically lock you up in your house for like 40 days, and they wouldn't come back and check on you until afterwards. So if you survive, yeah, that's great. But if they probably later find your dead bodies inside and things like that. I know during COVID they would quarantine people up to like 2 weeks and all that, but original quarantines were for 40 days overall. Of course, one thing that's very famous about the Black Death, of course, in England was the so-called Ring Around the Rosie song you may have heard of, which is a famous nursery rhyme that's well known to a lot of children later in life. And this actual nursery rhyme is associated with, of course, the Great Plague of London and the Black Death. A ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes to ashes, we all fall down. And so a lot of these were remnants from that period. Ring around the rosy, yeah, they would sometimes get a red rash around the mouth or actually around the bobo, I think, also as well. They would put flowers in their mask to basically, they thought that would prevent them from smelling or getting the actual plague and all that, which didn't really work. Violent sneezing associated with plague, but I think ashes to ashes was they sometimes burn the bodies. I know that, and so you got a lot of ashes and the stink of the death everywhere. We all fall down as everybody's dead or dying as well. So that's kind of scary thinking about that because I remember when I was a kid doing that, and you'd go around in a circle and in a ring or whatever. So. They also had this thing called the Great Fire of London, which happened, right after all this is kind of going on. And yeah, the Great Fire of London happened in September of 1666, where London, majority of the old medieval London, they went back to, Roman medieval times. Majority of the city actually burned in a great fire. It's considered one of the two worst catastrophes that happened in British history. And you kind of see images of it right here. But they think that the actual Great Fire of London was actually an accident that occurred where apparently there was a fire in a bakery. This man named Thomas Farner had this bakery on Pudding Lane, and the fire spread from there to the rest of the city within a few days, engulfed the whole city. And I think I want to say a maid that worked for him was one of the first to die. And there was a man later named Robert Hubert that claimed that he did it. Like he burned down the city. He was a French watchmaker that hated the British, who was more in supportive of like the Bourbon, I guess, regime in France. And they later found out that his confession was false. I think he was put to death for it, believe it or not. But it proved to be the fact that the actual fire was an accident. But the fire destroyed a lot of cities. You can see the burned out areas that fell to basically this massive fire catastrophe. And I think 13 some thousand buildings were destroyed at one point because of the Great Fire of London. 87 churches burned down, including St. Paul's Cathedral. One of the main churches there was burned down. They had to rebuild it later. But it didn't read like Whitehall and where the royal family was and all that. But it is considered one of the two worst disasters in British history. The other one you can see on the bottom left, of course, you had the Blitz, where Nazi Germany air bombed London and other cities during World War II, especially the 1940s. A lot of people died from that, like 50,000 people died, I know, in the Blitz between 1940 to 41, to give you an idea. Weird thing about the Great Fire of London is they don't know how many people died from it, but they do know that it changed a lot of the building codes afterwards. After they rebuilt London, they built a lot of the buildings differently, especially not using a lot of wood, with the exterior, and all that. And a lot of the streets were not as narrow. I think that was one of the problems with the streets being real narrow between each other, and the fire was able to spread easily from block to block. But I do know that the fire created a lot of refugees, like close to 100,000 people were homeless afterwards. I did want to mention a few other things that's kind of famous about Charles II, which is well known. There were some of these plots to kill Charles II and even his brother, James, the Duke of York, assassination plots that were kind of famous. There was one called the Popish Plot, where this man named Titus Oates started this conspiracy throughout the country that there were Catholics that were trying to overthrow basically Charles's reign. He was known as Titus Oates the Liar, and it created a lot of mass hysteria throughout the country where people hated Catholics, which they do for a while after that. He was later imprisoned for it, Titus Oates the Liar, but it was never really, I think, a real plot. But that was one thing. Then they had a bunch of members of parliament and others that wanted to basically kill Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York. It was called the Rye House Plot, which happened in 1683. And this was a deal where they were going to kill Charles II and his brother James as they were going to some horse racing events that were in Newmarket, which I think was in the eastern part of England. Newmarket is where the British have a lot of thoroughbred racing today. I think halfway there, they learned that there was a fire going on where half the city burned down or something like that. And they decided to come back and not go to the races. But a bunch of members of parliament were actually arrested for supposedly plotting to overthrow Charles and James and all that. So a lot of people did not really like them because they didn't trust them. They thought they were too pro-Catholic and things like that. Then they had this thing that through Parliament, they had the so-called Test Acts that came out, which there were two of these, one in 1673 and one in 1678. And this was actually this series of oaths that they issued with the British military, the British government, where you had to take an oath that you weren't Catholic, that you were a Protestant. And so that was a form of way to prevent people that were Catholic from having positions in the government or in the military, especially probably officers that might be in the British Army or British Navy and things like that. Oh, and then they had this other thing that happened too. They tried in 1679, which was called the Exclusion Bill, where Parliament tried to pass this bill to prevent James, the Duke of York, from becoming the king, because Charles II didn't have any heirs. It was going to go to his brother, Duke of York, James, later James II. And they didn't want him to become king because he had converted to Catholicism. So that was really considered a controversy, because of that. But of course, obviously, Charles II wouldn't sign the thing in the law and all that. So I want to next talk about also and get into it a little bit about James II. So Charles II dies in 1685. And so you get this other ruler that comes in, you see there on the right, which is James, the Duke of York, who, in fact, that becomes James II. So that was one of the other sons of King Charles I, of course. Now, I don't know if you know much about James II, the Duke of York. He's the one that actually New York in New York City is named after. Because at one point, you know about it, James actually owned the colonies of New York. He also owned the colony of New Jersey as well, which actually was one colony at one point, but they separated it later. But that's where they get the name New York City from, originally named after him. So he basically dies, but he dies, and of course James comes in, and it creates a lot of controversy because of the fact that James had converted to Catholicism when his brother Charles was on the throne. And so this is going to later lead to James II being overthrown in what they call the Glorious Revolution, which I'm going to, of course, talk a lot about today. a lot of people did not like James for two reasons. I'll give you right here. One, they think he was too tolerant towards Catholics, like he wanted the Jesuits to come into the country. I think he even wanted to allow Catholic schools, like Catholic universities, to be set up in England and things like that. And then also, James II was pro divine right. He wanted to have more absolute rule as well over Parliament, like I guess his father did, King Charles I. And so that created a lot of animosity between him and Parliament. So I think at first they liked him, and then they kind of mistrusted him because of all those things right there. Another reason they trusted him at first was because if you look on with that particular those two pictures, on the left is Anne Hyde. Anne Hyde was the first wife of King James II. And she had two daughters, which were Queen Mary II, who's later ruler, and then also Queen Anne, which both those were Protestant. They had, of course, however, she died. And I think the exact year it was, I think it looks like 1671 is when she died. And so a few years later, he decided to remarry the woman you see on the right, which was Mary of Modena, who has different names. 1673 is when he married her. She's also known as Mary Beatrice as well. And she was actually Catholic. I believe she was from part of Italy, northern Italy. And apparently a few years before this, they're not sure the exact year. It's either 1668 or 1669. They think James converted to the Catholic faith. And then, of course, he married a Catholic wife. Well, it wasn't a controversy at first because, he had those two heirs that are Protestant that he had. But what happened was in June of 1688, Mary of Modena had a son, of course, named James Francis Edward Stuart. You see, later has nicknames like the Old Pretender, or I think some of the Stuarts called him James III as well. And so that's a problem now, because now what's going to happen? The throne's going to go to the male first at that time. And so not to Anne Hyde's children. And so that's what creates all the controversy, with King James II. So what ends up happening is Parliament decides to invite basically this other ruler to come over and basically take power from King James II, and that's William of Orange. William of Orange was the ruler of the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands, or we call Holland today as well. And he was actually a nephew of James II. I think they call him the stadtholder of the Netherlands, or also called William of Orange, or Prince William of Orange. And he was married to the daughter of James II, which, of course, Mary called Mary II later. And basically, if you want to know the truth, they were first cousins. They had married each other and all that. And so they decided to invite them over, both of them, to come over and rule together jointly, William and Mary. And they actually wrote a letter to him. A lot of the members of Parliament got together, and they wrote this letter or invitation to William called the Immortal Seven letter, because there were 7 members of Parliament that helped write it up. And they basically sent it to him and basically invited him to come over and take over, Britain, to co-rule with his wife Mary. They'd rule together and all that. And so that's what led to the so-called Glorious Revolution. So William, with his forces, it's not too many, people have invaded England and taken over. I think Henry VII did, and William the Conqueror. But basically, he would cross the English Channel from the Netherlands. And James, at that point, did not have any support with, the military. The military wouldn't back him. And so he was forced to flee the country, where he fled to like France, basically, to get help from Louis XIV, who was related to him. And so the British later call it the Glorious Revolution. And it was seen as this bloodless coup, bloodless revolution, where very, very little bloodshed was exchanged between both sides, and a basic exchange of power took place. between both sides. So I'll get to it, of course, a little later. We'll talk about the fact that, that's going to lead to, I'll kind of talk about, where is it right here, the two I need. You've got William and Mary that come over. They're going to be joint monarchs that'll basically take power. They'll kind of rule side by side, you can see there, but eventually Mary will die first and then William, of course, in that order. I'm going to get to it later. I'll talk about the glorious revolution, in which you get this whole Bill of Rights being written up afterwards by Parliament, because I don't think William and Mary really coronated till 1689, as you know, and it's going to create a constitutional monarchy in Britain. They're going to go more towards a limited monarchy, where monarchy becomes more like almost like a figurehead within the country. But before I get to that, I did want to talk about something else that happened because of what occurred with, of course, the Glorious Revolution caused this thing called the Jacobite rebellions afterwards, because you had all these different pro Stuarts that wanted to put James's family back on the throne. It's called Jacobitism. It was popular in like parts of Scotland. It was popular in Ireland, especially areas where you had a lot of Catholics. I know in the Highlands of Scotland it was popular. Ireland was popular because they got Catholics there as well. And so between the 17th and the 18th centuries, you get a lot of these movements to try to put basically James, his son, grandson, on the throne and all of that. They had numerous of these rebellions that were kind of famous. And if you know about in Scotland, Ireland, they call them risings, like the Rising of 15, the Rising of 45. I think those were considered really the ones that were the most famous. The Williamite War, you can see 1689, 91. That was all part of the War of the English Succession, or 9 Years' War, that was kind of going on basically in Europe. Then they had a bunch of other risings, rising in 15, 19, and 1745. Those were also famous, although the rising in 15 and 45 are really, I think, the most famous ones that they had overall. James II, he actually tried to return, if you know about that, to Britain, and with the they call it the Williamite War, I think is what they called it, of course, in England. James actually invaded Ireland because he had a lot of supporters there that were Catholic, that wanted to put him back on the throne. And so he actually fought it out against the British forces of King William III, the so-called Battle of the Boyne, it's called, which took place on July 1st, 1690. But his forces were defeated, and he was forced to flee Ireland afterwards. In Ireland, they call it the War of the Two Kings, because you have these two kings, James II and William III, trying to fight to take control. Who's going to control Britain and all that afterwards. And the Irish, thinking that James is this pathetic ruler, general, or whatever, they called him James the Shit, or Shite. I think it's how they said it, of course. And that's kind of a nickname they called James II, the Irish. They do have some other ones that came in later that also tried to take the throne as well. They had James Francis Edward Stuart. That was the son, of course, of King James II. He was involved in the Rising of 15, where he basically shows up in Scotland to try to take power. And so he was able to get enough, Scottish forces, especially the Highlands, that supported him, to invade into northern England at one point. But his forces were defeated at the Battle of Preston also as well. So that one was not very successful, of course. That happened by the time of when the Hanover dynasty was coming in 1750, when King George I takes power, which I'll talk about later. And then on the right, they had another famous Jacobite that was big, which was Charles Edward Stuart, who they call Bonnie Prince Charlie. I may have heard of him. That's basically the grandson of King James II. They sometimes call him the young pretender, but he was later called Bonnie Prince Charlie. I think that one was more successful, the Rising of 45, because they were actually able to take control of Scotland at one point, the um, Jacobite side. But they were actually beat badly, though, if you know about this. April 1746, Battle of Culloden, the Jacobite side was routed in that battle. And after that, if you know about the Battle of Culloden, that was considered to be one of the last major battles that was fought on actual English or British soil. And you know that they also broke up the clan system afterwards in Scotland and all that. And so the Jacobite rebellions, there were no more after that, and pretty much no other Catholic Stuarts are going to get the throne because of that. So yeah, we're going to get, of course, to next talk about that. So yeah, William and Mary, they reigned as joint monarchs after that, especially after they accept the Bill of Rights, which was, of course, passed by Parliament in 1689. The Bill of Rights is important because it makes Britain this constitutional monarchy, a parliamentarian one, constitutional monarchy, where the monarch is like a head of state, and then later they'll have a prime minister that kind of heads up the government under the head of state. And kind of show images of it right here. But what the Bill of Rights will do is that it's going to, besides creating a constitutional monarchy, it's going to create a lot of the basic rights for all Englishmen that they have. It also helps to begin barring a lot of Catholic rulers from taking the throne. They also have the Act of Settlement I'll get to later in 1701 that does that later. But like basically, it basically said that, what the basic rights for all Englishmen will be in the country, because some of these rights had been limited before that under the Stuarts, like King James II. I've got a list of them. I'll kind of go through a bunch of them that, the Bill of Rights was important, in allowing. I'll talk about John Locke in a second, but John Locke was, of course, a major influence on the writing of the Bill of Rights. Yeah, these are some of the basic rights that were put in it. Well, obviously, the main thing that was put at the beginning of the Bill of Rights is that Parliament is the one that'll create all the laws of the country. They have a right to raise taxes, revenue, things like that, not the monarch. The monarch cannot do that. It also talks about free speech. People have, Englishmen have a right to free speech, right to petition the monarch if they want. No quartering of troops in peacetime, no excessive bail in royal courts. So things like that were ideas that they put in the Bill of Rights. Here's some other ones they put in it too. No imprisonment without charge. So they can't suspend your habeas corpus rights. They have to basically show why you're being imprisoned. What's the point of it? Courts must prove why you're being arrested, imprisoned, etc. I think they used to say, show me the body of evidence of why I'm in prison, and that kind of thing. All monarchs must follow the rule of law. So no monarch, no matter who he is not, above the rule of law, that kind of thing. Also, the Bill of Rights talks about the idea that all citizens have a right to trial by a jury, a jury of their peers, in things like that as well. Another thing too, if you go to it, they also passed another act, which was the Toleration Act, which came out as well. That gave basically religious rights to minorities, those that, weren't like Protestant, especially those that were like, Catholic and things like that. That's another thing that they did that was kind of influential as well. But John Locke, who you probably already know about, famous English philosopher, he was a major influence on the Bill of Rights. If you know about his famous essays, Two Treatises on Government was a major influence. And Locke talked about the idea that the government should be there to protect people's life, property, and things like that. Life, liberty, and property. And he of course, if you know about John Locke, he's one of the fathers of contract government, but he heavily influenced like the U.S. Constitution. We know that overall, and even our own Bill of Rights, United States Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. That was something definitely that was influenced by the British, English Bill of Rights as well. I think John Locke also influenced like a lot of the Declaration of Rights of Man, things like that, of course, with the French Revolution, and then also influenced as well Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in 1776 also. So he's definitely an influence, of course, John Locke on, of course, British pretty much politics. They do have a last Stuart monarch they have, which of course is Queen Anne. She reigns from 1702 to 14 after William III died. He died after Mary II died. And she was the younger sister, of course, of Mary II. And she's controversial because of the fact that she did not have any children that survived. You can see at one point she was pregnant like 17 times, and all of her children died. That's kind of tragic, isn't it? Overall, that's kind of a issue because of the fact that ends up causing the end of the Stuart dynasty, because the Stuart dynasty is going to be replaced by the House of Hanover, which will eventually take it over. And so because of the fact that she doesn't have any children to give the throne to or any heirs, basically what ends up happening is the Parliament passes this act, which is called the Act of Settlement, 1701, which gives the throne to the Protestant royal family in Germany, which is Hanover, House of Hanover. And I don't know if you know much about this, but they passed up like something like 54 people that were passed up in line of succession because of the fact that they were not Protestant. And so you end up with the Stuart, dynasty, of course, coming in as well. Another thing about the Act of Settlement is that it also, I think there was some statement in there saying that none of the rulers afterwards could be Catholic. And so that's why all these, people that were in line of succession got cut out because they weren't the right religion and all that. Oh, she's also famous under her reign. Acts of Union were passed by England and Scotland. And what that did was it officially created the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which was a name they were kind of using already going back to King James I's reign. But it made it, I guess, a legal issue at that point. Because of that, they created a new flag to support this idea that the United Kingdom now exists. And so they created the Union Jack. If you know, the Union Jack flag, of course, was developed afterwards. And you can see it represented all the different flags of England and Scotland at first, which you can see the one on the left was the original flag that they created where they merged the St. George's Cross, is the flag of England, with the flag of Scotland, St. Andrew's Cross. And so that's the flag you got at first. Then later in the 19th century, they then, of course, started using this other version of the Union Jack, where they added the St. Patrick's Cross of Ireland as well. So you got that in there. And so that's the flag they use today. Although, if you know about the part where the St. Patrick's Cross is, that part only now, I guess, represents Northern Ireland today, because later Ireland broke away and formed the Republic of Ireland. So that's kind of the Union Jack, and that's considered one of the most recognized flags, of course, in the world. Here's different flags. Of course, as the British Empire spread, the Union Jack was used all over the world for different flags. There are some that still use it today. I know Australia, New Zealand, I know are the main states that still use it. There's a few that still use it today throughout the world, and part of the British Commonwealth. Now, I'm going to also, for a few minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the later dynasties that take power, which there's really two last ones that they have, which is the House of Hanover, then the House of Windsor, which was originally called Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. And kind of go to this kind of, well, you can see a slide here where these are some of the later rulers that take power. Those are with the House of Hanover, that dynasty that reigns from 1714 to 1901. That's really when the British Empire starts peaking, is around that time. And this occurred because of the Act of Settlement I told you in 1701. George the First, who was known as George of Hanover, he came over from Germany and took power as the British ruler in 1714. And I told you because of the fact that he had all these Catholic Stuarts that got cut out of the line of succession, it ended up going to George. And George was actually related back to King James the First. He was a descendant of King James the First, so they had to go all the way back to him to find somebody. And his coronation was controversial. It actually sparked a bunch of riots. I think called it Hanoverian riots or something like that, or coronation riots, I think they were called actually, throughout the country, and even sparked the Jacobite rising of 15 or 1715 as well. So it was very, very controversial when George came in. I do have an image of George the First. When he came over, he didn't speak any English. He only knew German. In fact, he had a bunch of, I think, German mistresses that he brought kind of with him. And what's interesting about George, he was actually buried in Germany later. I don't think he was one of the very few of the British monarchs that's actually buried somewhere else. And he starts a period they call in British history called the Georgian era, where you have all these different monarchs that come in that are called George. So you got George the First, you got his son, George the Second. George III was the grandson of George II. Then you have George IV as well that comes later. And then they also have William IV they have later as well. It's kind of included as well with the Georgian era overall. One thing that occurs under George's reign that's very famous, you get the rise of these different political parties that seize power in Britain, like the Whig and the Tory parties. You see the rise of them. And about those two political parties, that's where you get a lot of the main political parties in Britain today. The Whig Party later is, where they get the Liberal Party. And the Tory Party is like the Conservative Party, like the remnants of that overall. And so both those kind of rose out of that. And the Tories, which were the more conservative one, they think that they originally were kind of descended from the Jacobites, believe it or not, who hated the Whigs, but the Whigs were more liberal. And I think today, if you look at the two parties, I know the Whig party's more liberal, and then the Conservative party's more left of centers somewhere. Is where the two basically are. Also, under George, a lot of things happened. Like Britain went through like a period where they started to industrialize. And I think Napoleon said that Britain starts to become the workshop of the world, which helps to, create the British Empire throughout the world. Also, they went through an agricultural revolution, which they think helped spur that on as well. Under George, the French Revolution happened. The American Revolutions both happened because George was the monarch when the 13 colonies broke away, when they rebelled against him. If you read the Declaration of Independence, they're talking about King George I, of course. Also, George was the king when Napoleon was in power as well. He was in power a long time. In fact, George reigned a bunch of years overall. I'm sorry, he's the wrong one I'm talking about. That's George III we're talking about. Oops, got the wrong one I'm talking about. But George the First, yeah, a lot of those, they're going to start to industrialize pretty much starting in the 18th century. George the First is also known for Robert Walpole, if you know about him, also George the First is one of the first to appoint really the first prime minister of Britain. So Robert Walpole came to power in 1721 and reigned till 1742. And so Walpole is considered the first of many of these prime ministers that take power, that rule. And under George, they start to develop the British cabinet system overall. And part of why George did this was because of the fact that the George did not speak English, which was kind of an issue. And so the prime minister was used as a go-between between, to work with Parliament and, of course, with the head of state, with the monarch, and all that. So George is kind of considered to be the one that really, starts the foundations of the British cabinet system, and why we have prime ministers, of course, later. And I think they were kind of emulating what the French were doing with their chief's head of state. Because remember, we talked about Richelieu and all that. Yeah, they have George the Third. Of course, I was talking about earlier. George the Third. It's really the longest reigning male monarch of the British. He came in later. He was actually a grandson of George II. And it's really under him that the British Empire starts to expand worldwide, because they start to colonize parts like Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world. George, it's really under him that's when England, Britain, and all that. England, Scotland first, I think, were the areas that really start to industrialize the most. And then under him, George the Third is the one where, the 13 colonies broke away originally. And the French Revolution also occurs under his reign. And then you have the age of Napoleon, I think near the end of his reign, that also occurs by the early 1800s. We'll get to the Napoleonic Wars, but they go from 1803 up to about 1815. And he's kind of in power when all that's kind of going on overall. He was known as Mad King George. I don't know if you ever heard about that before, but there was a period where King George went through some mental illness. They think he may have either suffered from being bipolar, but also maybe dementia. I think now is considered to be something that he kind of suffered from early in his life, believe it or not. He also had this blood illness called porphyria that was kind of well known, that kind of made him crazy as well. And so people called him, during his reign, sometimes Bad King George. They actually made a movie about it years ago called The Madness of King George. That's kind of, I think, won some Oscars and stuff like that. But I think they consider King George III to be one of the most famous of the Hanover monarchs, along there with King George I. They also got, of course, Queen Victoria, which everybody have heard about as well. She was a niece of William IV, who didn't have any children, and so the throne went to her. She's really the only female ruler, of course, of the House of Hanover, and she reigned from 1837 to 1901. For a long time, she was the longest reigning monarch of the British, at like around 63, 64 years. And it's really under her that the British Empire it really peaks, especially in the 19th century. And so often during her reign, they often call it the so-called imperial century. It's one of the nicknames they called it, as Britain began to expand throughout Africa, which they do, like the dark continent of Africa at the time. They also get more into Asia. About under her, India pretty much is one of their main colonies. It's where they get a lot of their natural resources that makes the British Empire what it is later. But they're also into the Pacific and all that, expanding more into Australia and all that as well. She controls Canada, and so her empire is massive under her. I think by the early 20s, it's 1920s, it's, pretty much getting to that 13, 14 million square miles that we're talking about. And so her reign is often called the Victorian era, Victorian age, because of her influence, but it's also a very conservative period because, the British were conservative on some of their values. But one thing about the British, they do think that their rising power, especially with their military, their navy, the British Navy, they're able to really promote world peace. That is one thing about them. They do kind of prevent a lot of world wars from kind of breaking out in the 19th century. And so a lot of people refer to that sometimes it's called the Pax Britannica because of the British peace. And so a lot of people compare, I think, the British at that time almost like the Roman Empire, how powerful it is, throughout the world. She actually married this man you see there named Prince Albert, who was the ruler of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which is two countries in small little countries in Germany that are there. And so that started a new dynasty that they call the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. That's usually what they called it. And there they are together, of course. He was basically a cousin of hers that she married. And the dynasty was later known as the House of Windsor, because I'll get to it later. They later would change, the name to that during World War One in 1917. And I think because it was such a German name, because the British later were fighting Germany in World War One, they didn't want to have a German name, but obviously they have some German origins that are there. And I think I've got a picture showing a picture of them together, which I think that was considered the first royal picture of any British couple. They're right there, which of course you see. And one thing about Queen Victoria, she had a nickname. She was called the Grandmother of Europe. She was called this because of the fact that she had so many children, grandchildren that ended up on like thrones and part of different world dynasties throughout Europe. I think the ones that are the most famous, if you know about, that became rulers in Europe, like outside Britain anyway, was like the emperor or czar of Russia. You had Nicholas II, who was her grandson, and the Kaiser or emperor of Germany, which was Wilhelm II, was also another grandson as well. So we'll kind of talk about that a little later. But for a lot of her children, end up fighting the World War in the early 20th century. Here's kind of a line you can see of the House of Windsor from Queen Victoria going down, originally called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, but they changed the name on July 17th, 1917, which I'll get to it later. It's actually named for Windsor Castle in England. You can see the going down, you got Edward VII, then you got George V, then you got his two sons, Edward VIII, George VI, and then finally the current ruler on the bottom, of course, you see there, Queen Elizabeth II. Let me talk about one of the first ones that came, first with the, of course, House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It's kind of a tongue twister, isn't it, of course, to say. But yeah, you do have Edward, you see there. That's, of course, the main son of Queen Victoria. He took over after his mother died in 1901. And so he'll reign for about 9 to 10 years as the ruler. He reigns during what they call the Edwardian era, is what they call it. It's kind of a nickname. I think some historians kind of view it as like an extension of the Victorian era a little bit overall. So I think they kind of see it as almost like going up to like World War One. At least his influences kind of went up to World War One. They think, and I'll get to it later. He does have a son, which is King George V, who would take over later after he dies. Then he's got two grandsons you can see that reigned later, Edward VIII and George VI. And his great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, is the current ruler that's in power today. Edward the Seventh. He's an interesting figure. He had a nickname they called him. By the way, he was often called the Peacemaker because he was involved in making a lot of alliances in Europe, which a lot of these will be kind of important later when World War One breaks out. Because one thing that Edward did, he helped to kind of foster relationships, especially between England and France. Those two countries start to be more friendly with each other, and they'll be major allies. Of course, in World War One. I think he started to reach out to Russia as well, because he's related to Nicholas II and things like that. And so that's something else that you also see as well. After he died in 1910, then you got King George V that came in. George V was the main ruler that reigned during like World War One. So when World War One broke out, and he is the one that would change the name of the dynasty, which I told you the original name of the dynasty was called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. But because, World War One breaks out in 1914, they're fighting against the Germans, and all that, they're cousins. And so they decided to kind of come up with a new name. And so in 1917, the monarch and the state decided to name it after the Windsor Castle and all of that. And so that's hence the name, of course, of where it came about. So that's why it's called House of Windsor. It's under his reign, by the way, that there's Windsor Castle, of course, an image right there. And by the way, Windsor Castle was one of the favorite residencies of course, Queen Elizabeth II, where she likes to go, reside sometimes. But yeah, here's a map showing you the peak of the British Empire. They think that under George V's reign, I guess between World War One and World War Two, that's really when the British Empire peaked in size. So between 13, 14 million square miles at one point, you can see the size of the British Empire. So it's obviously massive in size. Also, Edward VIII, George VI, those were sons of King George V that would follow later. I'll kind of talk briefly about those two men. Edward VIII, if you know much about him, he didn't reign very long. When he came into power, he had this issue where he wanted to get married. He was a bachelor when he became king, and he wanted to marry this American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. And part of it did not like this at all because she was a divorcee, but she had been married before. And so I don't think her marriage was even finalized, a divorce. And so he decided to basically pick love over the throne. And so Parliament allowed the abdication at that point. And so the throne then went to his brother on the right, you can see, who reigned from 1936 to 1952, which is George VI. And George VI, I'll get to him later. He's, of course, the father of the current ruler, Queen Elizabeth II. He'll reign through like World War II, in the earlier part, of course, of the early Cold War and all that. And it's under George VI as you have like Winston Churchill, probably one of the most famous prime ministers. That, of course, is well known. But if you know about George VI, I think the most famous thing that he's known for, he was very famous for having stammering problems, where when he'd give a speech, he would, stutter or stammer. And that was something that he had to overcome, during his reign. That's real, real famous. And they even later made movies about it, like the King's Speech, I think in 2010. That's very, very famous. But he would reign until 1952. And then obviously the current ruler now that everybody, of course, is known about today, of course, is Queen Elizabeth II. She's been reigning since 1952. I think since I want to say February, I believe it is. She's been reigning 70 years as the ruler. In fact, she has a son. I think everybody knows about Charles, the Prince of Wales. Has been also waiting for the throne just as long as she's been in power. So that's amazing about her. Of course, you just saw how they had that famous. They had that platinum jubilee. Of course, they had a couple weeks ago. Of course, to celebrate her 70-year reign. I think it was June 2nd to June 5th, of course. So yeah, if she keeps, living longer, she might, like another 2 years or so, she might pass up Louis the 14th. Louis the 14th, of course, is the longest reigning monarch, I think, in at least modern world history, anyway. So it's quite possible that she might do that. She's been in power so long, by the way, she's had 14 prime ministers under her. That's amazing. Which I think the most famous ones are Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. And so she's been, I think her mother lived to be 100. So it's quite possible she might live to be 100. Who knows about that? Who's going to be the monarch if she dies? Well, obviously, Charles, the Prince of Wales, he's been waiting a long time. It's quite possible, obviously, he's going to take over unless he dies before she does. So he's the next in line to succession, according to Parliament. The next in line after that would be then William, the Duke of Cambridge. He would come next. Prince William might be. I think a lot of people want him to be the king, maybe, because he's younger. He's got 3 children, of course, as well. And so quite possibly, yeah, that could, of course, happen. So anyway, that basically wraps up my lecture, of course, on the rise of the British Empire. Before I go, don't forget I am posting a few assignments out there. I think there's a new assignment y'all will see in announcements today, which is the British quiz. I'll post that today for y'all to start working on. And then don't forget the main things y'all should be working on is the first exam and then the bonus quiz on the scientific revolution and age of enlightenment. And I do have a new vocab, of course, assignment that's out too. Y'all can start working on as well. Looks like I went over a little bit today, and I'm sort of an hour and 15 minutes, kind of late today. But I know later in the week I'll have some recorded lectures I'll kind of announce, which will be on the French Revolution and age of Napoleon. So those will be recorded. And I think next week, live lectures, I'll kind of be moving on to like talking about the 19th century, which will be like in week 5. So that's it for today. I hope everybody has a great rest of the week and weekend, of course, coming up. But I'll see y'all later. If y'all have a comment or question, I don't think there's any questions. It looks like it to me, what I can tell. But if you have a comment or question, you can always leave that, of course, later, or email me if you got a question about the class. So y'all take care. And I'll, of course, see y'all later.